Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Today, I will introduce you to Iran. Iran is a land of culture, but yet united by Islam. This is a land that has been the birthplace of empires and a place where empires were killed. A place where languages unite and yet some try to get away. A place that has been the king or a pawn in the king's game. Today, I will introduce you to Iran. Iran is an Islamic republic currently, and it has been for almost 1,000 years. Ever since the patriarchal caliphate came and made it Islamic. But if you just think that Iran has always been an Islamic republic, the evidence proves otherwise. They were a Zoroastrian society, and they were a global power in the world. But when Iran fell to Arab invasions, a new culture was born. Not an Arab culture, but a Persian one. But if we want to learn about Iran, we have to go all the way back to the start, when the Achaemenid Empire came to power. It was a Zoroastrian empire. It reached from the end of Gujarat to the tip of Greece. It had 44% of the population in the world, and it had always been the superpower of the world. But that all changed when Alexander the Great came into power. He pushed for control over the world, and as we all know, he succeeded. After Alexander died, there would be no major empire in Iran until the Sunni Arabs came along to Iran. They spread Islam like wildfire from district to district, province to province, then eventually the entire area of Iran. The Zoroastrian religion died, but the culture lived on. It is said that they could have changed their language, their culture, their life, but they did not. They kept on holding on, and eventually the Arabs left, and new dynasties came to take over Iran. Now take India. Islam in India is semi-popular with having over 200 million adherents. But still, it is a minority religion to India's 1.4 billion people. With taking over 14% of the population, now imagine that to take over now 90% of the population of India. That is the case with Iran, and that happened under 60 years. Comparing that to other dynasties, that was a pretty quick conversion. So how were they able to convert Iran to Shia Islam? Well, when the Safavids came to Iran, they started a process of forced Shiite conversion among the Sunni population, and in the end they succeeded what doing many empires could not: enforce their religion. And the only person at fault here was Ismail I. He had anti-Sunni propaganda, and he destroyed mosques, towns, and people that were not willing to convert to Shiite Islam. He was so terrible that the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire even says this: he has laid waste to mosques, as it is said, constructing idol temples in their stead, that you have torn the noble fiber of Islam with the hand of tyranny, and that you have called the glorious Quran the myths of the ancients. The rumor of these abominations has caused your name to become like that of the Hadith, deceived by Satan. There were so many rulers after Ismail, and they each did something, but they would take over the entire story. So let us just skip to the end. But, in a quick summary, they made a deal with the Russians. They also fought against the Russians. They fought against the Ottomans. They won and they lost. But they left their mark on history of Iran, and that is undeniable, either for better or for worse. In the end, the Safavids succeeded in their goal of molding Iran into their image. The dynasty lasted for 200 years. When their last ruler, Abbas III, was killed, Nazir Shah became the new ruler of Iran. It was not the Safavids this time, it was the Ashfarid dynasty. They had a ruler known as Nazir Shah, who, with his skill in battle, took over the lost lands and major cities of India. He was the peak of the empire, and he had the greatest empire only before the Sasanian Empire. But as everything has to do, the empire came and it went. As this will be a common theme in the story, the Shah dies, and when the Shah died, the nephew took the throne, and he was not as good as a ruler as the Shah before him. So, the power in the areas noticed this. Slowly, parts started to break away. First was Afghanistan, then Georgia, and then India, and so much more until it could not last. and was passed down to the Zands. The Zands were one of the many short-lived dynasties of Iran, and they only lasted for 50 years. To put that into perspective, that is around the rule of one monarch. The Zands were mediocre rulers at best, and they barely did anything of good note in the ruling sense. They established the modern-day borders of Iran, but they did let art and culture flourish. It was a time of peace. When the ruler of Zands, Kairam Khan, died, his incompetent son took over the throne, and his son was influenced by his half-uncle, Abu al-Fath, and his commander, Zaki Khan. Soon, the Qajars came along, and they took over the dying empire with ease. The Qajars were again a 100-year dynasty that had a history of art, war, and conquest. But this time, integral parts of Iran were lost to the Russians. Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia, they were all taken away by Russians. The Balochistan region were heavily influenced by the British. In one way they never thought of, India. If we look at actual geography, Balochistan is just a flat desert plain. The British could easily just go from the province of Balochistan to the Iranian province of Balochistan. Soon, they would face heavy losses under the Ottomans, Russians, and the British. The British wanted Persia for their island of Hormuz. The Russians wanted Armenia and Azerbaijan, and all the colonizers wanted a piece of Iran. But they held on. They adopted Western science, and they used the rivalry between Russia and Great Britain to keep themselves independent. But at the end, the interests of Russia and Great Britain were too great for the Persians, and they were occupied in the Second World War. The empire fell apart, and it was no longer an empire, but a constitutional monarchy. You might be wondering why I included the last dynasty of Iran. Well, nothing ever goes perfect in Iran, and this is the case with the Pahlavi dynasty. The Pahlavi dynasty was ruled at first by Reza Shah, who was the main builder of infrastructure in Iran and was the main source of the revival of Iran. Well, at least in his eyes. Everybody liked him, but when you take in the fact that Iran is highly religious, and anything that is offending from Islam is taken as an offense to them, he was public enemy number one. He forced people to wear Western clothes. He declared that hijab was not mandatory and that women could go to work. This is all commonplace nowadays, but in most Muslim countries, Afghanistan, this is strictly banned. The tension was boiling. Iran is already a fractured state, but when you bring in foreign powers into play, this just makes the state that is fractured even more fractured. All for a profit to an island in the North Sea. Reza Khan wanted to balance out the power of foreigners and the British, and in that term he failed successfully. He managed to keep out the British and the Soviets until the joint invasion of Persia. Reza Khan was forced to abdicate and he was sent to Mauritius, and then he died in South Africa. When he died, his son Mohammad Reza Shah came and ascended to the throne. But he would be the last Shah of the short dynasty. Mohammad Reza Shah did everything that his father did. But there's one catch. There was a government, a parliamentary democracy, and when the Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh was elected, he was forcing the British to get out of Persia so that he could use the oil for the infrastructure of Iran. The British was really mad about this, so they restored an oil embargo, and they complained to the US that Iran was stealing their oil. The US was fine with that, but when Eisenhower came in, the British told Mohammad Mossadegh was a communist and a Soviet supporter, and that was enough to get Eisenhower hooked. The coup took 4 days and Mohammad Mossadegh was the main source of it all. He had to go through the entire coup and was later taken to a prison. After that, he was let out and denied a funeral and was buried in his own home. This made the Shah more powerful and made him to exert his control over Persian oil fields and make deals with the Western powers. However, what the British and Americans thought of as a success, they never knew what would come next. In the background, the clergy were tired of being oppressed and suppressed in Iran. So they began to plot, a plot about an overthrow, and Ruhollah Khomeini was the main guy. He was always a clerk, and this time he wouldn't be a clerk anymore, he would be the supreme leader of Iran. The coup lasted for 1 year and 1 month. It was so large that around 10% of its population was marching against Mohammad Reza Shah. The people wanted an Islamic republic. The Shah didn't want that. He had a secret servants agency called Sabak, which helped him see himself as a good image. He killed any bad mouters, so you could see why everyone was mad. For the Shah, things were even worse. He had cancer. He was too busy looking into nothing at his Caspian resort while the rebellion was going on. When his allies were not supporting him in this campaign, he thought that the people were trying to get him removed from his power, and he blamed the Western powers. Slowly, the rebellion came to an end, and the Shah was deported off to Egypt. He was a king, he was a monarch, he was a ruler, but in the end, he died with the smallest funeral and a small grave. Now, the dream that Rahullah always wanted is the real Iran, an Islamic theocracy. The clergy were given power, and there was no outside interference in Iran. This is the first time in 50 years that Iran has not been used for natural gases by outside powers. So Iran has always been a country, united by Islam, divided by culture, and everything is stuck in between. This is the story of Iran. I'm really thankful that you listened to this. And now, some things on Iran. Iran is now a modern, functioning society that is doing pretty well without outside help. Despite the fact that its GDP has been divided by 3, and its GDP per capita is not really doing so well right now. But other than that, Iran is a really good, functioning modern society, and it's an example of how Iran and any other countries like this can grow. It doesn't need to be surrounded by Western neighbors. So, now you have to go think at these situations and ponder. Was there any good guys? Was it just full of bad guys who just wanted to control the entire Iranian peninsula and use it for oil? Were there any good guys? I don't know. No one will ever know. Thank you for listening to my story of Iran. Goodbye.